Thank you. It's great to be here. Enjoyed Alex's comments very much. I highly recommend his book. It's an excellent book. I'm going to be talking today about my notes. I don't have my notes. Are you going to put them up? No? Okay. I'm going to get my notes. There we go. Thank you. I'm going to talk today a little bit about blockchain, but mostly I'm going to talk today about the future of consumer banking. Alex sort of laid this foundation of this core technology, and that's a piece of the puzzle. But there are a lot of other pieces that are affecting consumer finance and the transformation of how all of us are going to interact with money. A few years ago, Sean, who's my co-founder, and I founded Circle, and we looked around at a number of pretty significant technical forces that were happening that would change how money works in the world, change the user experience of money, and would have ultimately pretty significant implications for the world economy. And those were the blockchain. The second was the advent of at-scale machine learning and AI and the ability to apply that in financial services, and new user experiences, new UXs for money, primarily inspired by what I like to call social payments. So the vision, though, for us was that money should work the way the internet works, and that we can send and receive content, we can share information, we can communicate, we can search all the world's knowledge instantly, globally, without fees. But for a whole host of reasons, money doesn't work that way. And we thought, now it's possible, and we want to build a global consumer internet financial franchise inspired by those ideas. So you've just gotten a relatively long lecture on the blockchain. I'm going to have a much more condensed one. And actually, I should also say, I'm going to take questions after about 10 or 12 minutes or so. So as some of these themes kind of tickle your interest, feel free to ask questions at the end. So how do I define the blockchain? It's a suite of open protocols and formats for exchanging value and settling a transaction globally, instantly, and without fees. I like to think of it in very similar terms to other open internet protocols that we just take for granted today. So there's HTTP, and there's SMTP, and there's VoIP. Those are protocols that unleashed distributed networks to exchange information, data, and communications in a distributed model, largely peer-to-peer, and it allows us to do all these things that we do today globally that we all take for granted. So it's similar in concept to that. More specifically, I like to think of it as a public global record-keeping system that's incorruptible, that's immutable, no one can change it. And like other open protocols, it's an open network. It's permissionless. Anyone can connect to it and use it. Like today, I can go download a piece of software and create my own mail server, and it will work with Gmail, and it'll work with any other email service in the world. Similarly, I can download a piece of software and create a web server, connect it to IP, and a couple billion people can then instantly access that without cost. And so it's an open model. So anyone in the world who uses these protocols has access now to this global, immutable, incorruptible record-keeping system and transaction engine. That's really powerful, and that's what we saw a few years ago. So some of this was alluded to in the prior talk, but there's this distinction that people increasingly make between a public blockchain and private blockchains. So the Bitcoin blockchain is a public blockchain. It's open to the whole world, just like a public website versus, say, a private intranet, the example that was given earlier as well. So there are private blockchains, and I think those have narrower use cases, but where people don't want an open model, or they don't want to trust cryptography and mathematics. They'd rather trust people, and so they build these networks that can do that, but still involve a level of human trust. But our view, and what we've built Circle on, is public blockchains, and we think that's actually where the really revolutionary things happen with money. It's not, banks improving their back office with this technology. It's actually changing the way this actually affects every business, every consumer, every organization in the world, the same way that the web did. The key, though, to make this work for consumers is seamless integration between existing forms of money, existing money formats. And money itself, actually, if you dig in, it's just data and text file formats. That's what euros are. That's what dollars are. It's just data and text file formats. So we've got to merge that existing formats of money with the blockchain. And to do that, governments around the world have started to say, OK, if you want to do that, you can do that, but you're going to be regulated like a bank. You're going to have to meet a whole set of requirements to monitor transactions and know your customer and track and prevent financial crime and all this kind of stuff. And that's what a company like Circle's been doing, is working with governments to go get all the necessary licenses so that we can connect the existing financial system and all existing forms of money, but to this network, to this blockchain. And so what that allows, though, is it allows consumers and businesses to get the benefits of digital currency: instant settlement, global reach, highly secure and nearly free transactions, but not needing to use a new currency. I would guess that most of the people in the room here would prefer euro or sterling or dollars to Bitcoin. Bitcoin's an interesting asset to invest in. You're sort of investing in the network almost like an equity, but it's not interesting to most consumers as a currency. And so we want to give everyone the benefits of that network, but do it with the existing system of money that we have today. So that's key, is sort of routing currencies over the blockchain. So the second piece, and actually, just to close that out, I mean, essentially, the vision here is that, just like HTTP and SMTP and VoIP and on and on and on, opened up a world of free and instantaneous global information sharing and communications, that the blockchain is going to very much do the same thing for money. And it's going to very much do the same thing for a wider variety of financial products, not just currency value, but lots of other forms of financial value, structured assets. So it's a significant building block, but it's really just an underlying infrastructure and protocol that we can take advantage of, and anyone can take advantage of. So as we were envisioning, building a kind of global consumer bank of the future, we knew that this was going to be one of the things that we would build on. Now, another kind of key concept here with money is, why are payments expensive? We heard the example earlier of, when you swipe a card or tap a card, just using the most advanced form of electronic payments that we have today. There's 7 intermediaries. It actually, in the end, takes days, et cetera. But businesses who accept electronic payments, or consumers who share value with each other around the world, it's actually quite expensive. So why is that? Well, what you find is that money, when you peel back the onion, money is literally just data. We have paper tokens, but those are really references to a central bank ledger. And the ledger is a database. And banks are effectively regulated database operators. They're allowed to have a database that has records in it that are called euro or dollar and whatnot. And that's literally what the case is. If you go inside a bank and you look for the money, there's a SQL database and it's got records in it, and they're allowed to have those records. And they're allowed to transmit files back and forth to other banks that include references to those records. They have access to those files. So payments itself is essentially just synchronizing these databases. That's the technical task of going from point A to point B. And so with blockchain protocols, with cloud software where we can run all this stuff globally, scalably on the internet, we can have the cost ultimately approach zero. Now, there's a bigger issue, though, which is that banks are regulated because they intermediate risk. They take on social obligations. Historically, those have been around preventing crime, making sure you are who you say you are, and they're acting as agents of government law enforcement, in a sense. And so that's not going to change. These intermediaries are going to need to do that, and that's expensive. That's what we call compliance in bank parlance. And banks have huge compliance staffs, and so they do these human processes to manage all this. And they use software as well, but there's, JP Morgan Chase, biggest bank in the world. I think they brag about having 40,000 people in compliance, and that's supposed to be a good thing. So what if we could automate compliance and again, by doing that, bring the cost of value exchange and using money closer to zero. And that's where machine learning and AI come into play here. They make it possible to automate vast amounts of risk decisions, enabling cost efficiencies and allowing value transfer to be free all around the world. So in our case at Circle, we started building our machine learning and AIs a couple years ago, and they've gotten quite good. About 90% of the decisions, the risk decisions about identities, about transactions, about all this stuff are made by AIs. And when the AI isn't certain, it feeds those decisions to risk analysts who have proprietary tools that we give them where they can make judgments as humans, which then further trains the models and improves the learning and makes those AIs smarter. And so we're able to support an enormous range of customers, transactions all around the world at a tiny, tiny fraction of the cost. So this combination of blockchain as a open transaction settlement network and ledger and AI, when you bring those together, really lets you reinvent a huge part of banking and of financial services, in particular in this realm of payments. The final piece that's related to this is, the bank of the future is just software. When you realize that money is data, and now that we have devices that are actually payment instruments, literally money is just data and software. And so the sort of battleground, if you will, becomes one about what's the consumer UX of money. Historically, it's been paper tokens. It evolved to be plastic tokens. But now, it's just data and software on phones and in the cloud, and using all these kinds of technologies. What is the future of the UI of money? And we've barely begun to scratch the surface of this just in the past couple of years. So we've got this phase, and our belief is that kind of consumer finance in the future and the use cases for how consumers and businesses interact with money are going to be radically different than we think, far different than we think. Just like in the early days of the internet, we couldn't imagine things like Facebook, or we couldn't imagine things like Twitter. We couldn't imagine things, like Snapchat, or any of these metaphors for communications. We could think about sending a message and a phone call, and that was sort of as far as we could go in terms of thinking about communications. So I think we're in the early stages of this. So what can we learn from the history of consumer internet software about the future user experience of money? In particular, we were inspired, and this is kind of going back when we started this a few years ago, we were really inspired by China. And so China is years ahead of the West in the future of money and banking, in my view. Several years ago, social payments became the new UX of money for a huge percentage of Chinese society. And that's grown and grown and grown every year to the point where about 500 million Chinese consumers use social payment apps as how they interact with money. That these are apps that like Alipay and WeChat Pay that merge messaging, your social graph, media, and P2P payments into an integrated experience. It's building on the user interaction paradigms that have achieved mass scale on a global basis, and saying money's just part of that. And there's a lot we can learn from that. That hasn't happened here. It hasn't happened in Europe. It hasn't happened in the US in any meaningful scale. So there's a lot we can learn from that. But I think when you combine these pieces, messaging-oriented conversational user interfaces, artificial intelligence, bots that are actually driven by artificial intelligence, and fun expressive experiences, that's actually the future UX of money. It's not your mobile banking application that you have in your pocket. It's going to be something radically different. So, just to conclude, as I've emphasized, we're in the really early stages of this, not just Circle the company, but this whole movement to reinvent the consumer experience of money. Will consumers shift their financial relationships to be governed by, from being governed by banks to being governed by mobile operating system companies, social messaging and social network companies? Or will new forms of global internet-based consumer financial companies emerge that kind of bring these together? And we certainly think so, and that's what we're trying to do. Those are my comments, and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Jeremy is open to answer your questions.
I think I'm the first person who's asked for questions.
Yeah,
it's not just an interview on stage.
Don't be shy. Wow.
There's a question.
Yes. Who are you? And speak a little louder.
I'm Aaron Koenig. I had some Bitcoin talk here some time ago with Stephanie. And my question is, how do you see the role of government in the future, in the blockchain future? Would you rather go for people like BitNation who think the governments would be obsolete and everything would just be decentralized? Or would you rather think like Factum and these companies that give those better services to just make government more efficient?
Yeah.
What would you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long discussion, so I'll give you a very brief answer. Within the realm of money and currency, I think that what we'll see is that central banks will issue a cryptographic currency. And they'll create architectures that are based on distributed ledgers and blockchains, and they'll allow intermediaries to interact with that. And they may even allow consumers to directly interact with central bank money in that way. That's what the Bank of England is studying doing. That's what the People's Bank of China is very actively studying doing. There are huge advantages to central banks across auditability, accountability, monetary policy administration, efficiencies, financial crime enforcement, just huge improvements that can be had if they do that. That will take some time, but I think that's what happens with respect to money, and I think that intermediaries that provide financial services will still be regulated, and there'll be laws and so on. The longer answer involves sort of how can you apply blockchain to governance itself and to the structure of what government does, and there may be places where things that government do will be done as software on blockchains, and it will allow for more global forms of institutions. I actually think that'll be the case, but that's probably a bit of a longer road.
My name is Gary from Samcon. How does this affect the stock exchanges worldwide, what you are seeing?
Yeah, I mean, my focus is really on consumer banking, consumer finance. There's a whole nother realm of blockchain technology for securities. And so just as an example, NASDAQ is running trials where you can issue equities as tokens on the Bitcoin blockchain. And so it's not a stock certificate anymore. It's actually a cryptographic hash that is a record that is stored on a blockchain. And if you want to move that stock to someone else, you send a transaction message to the blockchain, and it moves that to some other address. So stocks, how they're stored, how they're custodied, how they're secured, how they're shared globally, I think moves to that model. Blockchain technology is not really ideal for like the real-time exchange part of it. Those will probably tend to be centralized kind of real-time exchanges. But I think it impacts any kind of exchange that is involved in transacting and settling and sharing any kind of financial asset, whether that's a futures contract or a stock, a bond, et cetera. One last question. Yeah. So the question was, sort of where do we see blockchain with respect to compliance issues and money laundering, financial crime, et cetera? It's a huge area. There's a phrase that's being used in the US now of RegTech, and they're really excited about blockchain as a regulatory technology because for the first time, you can automate and analyze and do forensics on transactions in a public way, right? If you want to go audit a company, you have to trust that they have a good controls internally, that the software hasn't been compromised, you trust their books and records, but that's what an auditor does. Well, now I can just write a script that can analyze, with permission through cryptographic keys, to analyze all those transactions and do a cryptographic audit, just as an example. Another example, and then I'll wrap up, because I know we're behind schedule, is we work really closely with law enforcement because we're required to. But what's really interesting is what they tell us is, banks have to file what are called SARs, as you know, suspicious activity reports. So if we see something going on that we think might be criminal, we have to report that to the government within certain conditions, certain thresholds, size, scale, et cetera. But what's really powerful about public blockchains is that they create a public transaction history. Now, it's pseudonymous. You don't have all the identity data, but there are forensic techniques, and there's software, and we employ it and automate it to allow us to basically know, is this payment going to a black market? Is this payment been correlated? And our AI helps make decisions about this. Has this been correlated with other forms of fraud or criminal activity? And so we have an incredible amount of data that we're able to generate that you can't in the cash economy. And you can't really with the opaque nature of financial institutions. It's really hard. So the law enforcement folks have told us that the data we give them is some of the very best data that they've ever gotten from financial institutions. So I actually think it opens up a lot of opportunities. It raises other questions around privacy as well. But short answer is I think it'll have a big impact. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.